Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. We begin with breaking news as President Trump and his team are now setting the stage for complex negotiations with Russia and Ukraine to end the war nearly 3 years after Russia's unprovoked invasion. President Trump today spoke to both Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in separate phone calls. In a readout of his call with Putin, the president said they spoke about several subjects, including agreeing to begin those negotiations on ending the Ukraine war. He also said he and Putin extended invitations to each other to visit one another's countries. According to reporters in the Oval Office right now, President Trump said a meeting with Putin would probably happen in Saudi Arabia. He also said that he doesn't think it's practical for Ukraine to have NATO membership and that it's unlikely Ukraine gets all its land back. Both Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy said they discussed the possibility of peace during their call earlier today. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters the president viewed the calls as a positive step and is committed to finding a deal.
I myself just spoke to the president about these calls, and he told me to tell all of you they were very good calls, they were very positive, and the administration is wholeheartedly committed to a peace deal to end once and for all the Russia-Ukraine war.
It comes after President Zelenskyy met with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Kyiv, saying he hoped President Trump would push Putin on a deal.
I'm thankful to the president, to his message that he will support Ukraine and he really wants to stop this war. And I know that he's a strong man, and I'm sure that he will push Putin.
All of this as an American citizen, along with 2 other individuals, were released from custody in Belarus earlier today. That follows the surprise release of American teacher Mark Fogel yesterday, who was held in Russia for 3.5 years in a prisoner exchange that will see a convicted money launderer named Alexander Vinnik return to Russia. Fresh off the plane last night, Mark Fogel went right to the White House, where President Trump personally thanked Putin and said the exchange could impact negotiations to end the Russian war in Ukraine.
I think there's goodwill in terms of the war. You know, 1.5 million soldiers, young people have been killed.
I've met many of them.
I think this could be the very important element. You could be a big part of it, actually, because it could be a big, important part of getting the war over with Ukraine. And we appreciate President Putin's what he did. He was able to pull it off for you, right? He was able to pull it off. We think, and you're here, so it was great.
Extraordinary images there. The big question now is just what President Trump is looking to offer to get both Zelenskyy and Putin to the table. Speaking earlier today in Brussels, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that 2 of Ukraine's demands in particular, to join NATO and restore its borders, were just not realistic.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Joining me now to start us off on a very big day, NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez is at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, also joins us. Thanks to all of you for being here. Gabe, let me start with you at the White House and these extraordinary phone calls. What do we know about the conversations and about where things potentially stand to get peace talks started?
Hi there, Kristen. Well, certainly a lot of fast-moving developments here. And before I get to those phone calls, I'm looking down at my phone because we are just getting some of the first details from President Trump in the Oval Office. This is not being played out live, but we get pool reports. But we are just getting also some Reuters wires right now from the wire services describing what President Trump is saying. He is saying that he does not think it's practical for Ukraine to have NATO membership. He hasn't committed to going to Ukraine, but he does say that he and President Putin ultimately expect to meet probably in Saudi Arabia. So those comments come, Kristen, after dramatic developments today where President Trump saying that he spoke both with President Putin and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Of course, this marks a seismic shift in U.S. foreign policy because obviously during the Biden administration, the U.S. was giving weapons to Ukraine, but now it's shifting to direct negotiations with Russia's president. So a lot of questions about where this goes from here. But in the phone calls earlier today, President Trump saying it was a productive conversation with Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin says that it's inviting President Trump to Moscow. And then in his phone call with President Zelenskyy, President Trump saying that he, like Putin, wants to make peace, and also announcing that Vice President J.D. Vance, as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, now plan to meet with Zelenskyy Friday at the Munich Security Conference, Kristen.
That's right, Gabe. And one of the notable developments I thought today also is that we learned that President Trump has actually appointed a team of people to help foster these negotiations. What do we know about that team? Yeah,
top U.S. officials are now heavily involved in this, and we're also learning that the Saudi Crown Prince, also MBS, also will be involved in these negotiations and has been key to the negotiations thus far. But we also heard that Trump's envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, playing a critical role here. Of course, he went yesterday to Russia on his private plane to bring back American school teacher Mark Fogel. And there has been a flurry of prisoner releases now. As you mentioned, just learning that 3 detainees have been released by Russia's close ally Belarus today, including an unnamed U.S. citizen. But that dramatic homecoming last night with Mark Fogel returning to the U.S., the private plane with Steve Witkoff and other U.S. officials, we understand, was just in Russia for less than 11 hours, but secretly whisking Mark Fogel after 3.5 years of being wrongfully detained, according to the U.S., bringing him back to the U.S. and back to his 95-year-old mother, who had appealed directly to then-candidate Trump just before his fateful rally last summer in Butler, Pennsylvania, Kristen.
Yeah, just remarkable to think about the strength of his mother in all of this. Gabe, thank you so much for that. Ref Sanchez, let me turn to you. You're covering Pete Hegseth at that defense conference in Brussels, and he did make some extremely notable comments about what he thought could potentially be on the table and off the table in these talks. What were the key takeaways for you?
Yeah, Kristen, so he announced that going forward, the United States is prioritizing the Indo-Pacific, China, securing its own borders, deprioritizing security in Europe. And he very bluntly told the European allies at this meeting at NATO headquarters here in Brussels that from now on, it is going to be up to the Europeans to provide the bulk of military support for Ukraine. He said this sitting just a couple of seats away from Ukraine's own defense minister, bluntly telling him that his country needs to abandon the goal of recovering all the territory that it has lost to Vladimir Putin's Russia since 2014. That includes Crimea. That is a major shift away from the Biden administration's position. They consistently said, Kristen, as you'll remember, that it was up to Ukraine to set its own military objectives. And the goal of the United States and NATO was to put Ukraine in as strong a position as possible going into these negotiations. That was not the language that Pete Hegseth used today. He went further, saying that NATO membership was not on the table for Ukraine as part of this peace deal. And he said American forces would not take part in any peacekeeping mission as part of an agreement to end the conflict. Chris.
So, Raf, so far, what reaction are you hearing, are you learning about from the United States allies in the region?
You know, it's been very interesting here at NATO, Kristen. If the NATO allies are frustrated, if they are exasperated, they are keeping it quiet, and they are very much trying to keep the Trump administration inside of the tent and to do everything they can to signal that they are accommodating. So one of Trump's big demands is that the NATO allies up their defense spending from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP. That is a very big jump, especially for a lot of these European countries that have big welfare systems. But you heard the Secretary General of NATO, you heard the British Defense Secretary, who was chairing this Ukraine meeting, all saying, we hear what the Trump administration is calling for, and we will act. Europe will spend more money on defense. It will boost its own defense industrial base. And they are really, really trying to show the Trump administration that they are trying to meet them at least halfway. Whether we get to a point that this just becomes zero sum, the Europeans are simply unable to meet that 5% spending demand, we will see. But for now, they are trying to sound accommodating. Kristen.
Well, certainly significant, particularly as we anticipate these potential talks between President Zelenskyy and President Putin. Raf Sanchez, thank you so much. Let's turn now to Ambassador Bill Taylor. Ambassador Taylor, wow, just extraordinary developments over the past 24 hours. Put all of this into context for us. You have the prisoner swap, the release of Mark Vogel. Now you have President Trump having had conversations with both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. What do you make of where this crisis stands right now?
Well, Kristen, this is a real opportunity. This is what certainly the Ukrainians and the Americans have been looking for, to stop this war. The question is, can President Trump or the Americans or NATO more broadly bring pressure on President Putin to come to some kind of an agreement? President Putin started this war, and as several people have said, including this administration, he can stop it when he wants. It's a good move that there's conversations between President Trump and President Putin and President Trump and President Zelenskyy. That's what needs to happen. President Zelenskyy needs to be involved. Obviously, President Putin needs to be involved. And President Trump is bringing them together to make this possible to end this war.
What do you make, though, when you hear Defense Secretary Hegseth say NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine and they will have to concede some territory? Is that not just a win for Vladimir Putin, basically rewarding him for illegally invading sovereign territory of Ukraine?
No one wants to reward Putin for illegally invading a sovereign nation. You can listen very carefully, though, to what the defense secretary said. He said that NATO membership would not be part of this discussion, these negotiations. Of course not. Of course, we're not going to negotiate Ukraine's membership in NATO with the Russians. That will never happen. So the secretary is exactly right. That's not part of this negotiation. That will be separate. That will be a decision for the Ukrainians and NATO. On the question about the rest of the issues, that whether or not there will be a peacekeeping force, and let's be clear, it's not just peacekeeping force with blue helmets, Kristen. We're talking about a deterrent force, a force that can deter another invasion by Russia. So it's a deterrent force, and that will be apparently comprised of European nations' forces, not U.S. forces on the ground. He was very clear about that. There could be other ways to support this European force, but that is the kind of thing. The last thing on the business about not taking back all of the 1991 borders by force, this is also what President Zelenskyy has already said. He has said he's willing to stop the hot portion of this war and not try militarily to take back all the territory to 1991 borders. And he's willing to do that negotiating. He's willing to do that diplomatically. He, though, this is an important point, Kristen, that is President Zelenskyy will never recognize, nor should the rest of the world ever recognize, the Russians' illegal annexation of that part of Ukraine, that 18% of Ukraine that Putin now occupies.
Well, I think you raised such a critical point, Ambassador, and let me just follow up with you on it. Can Ukrainian security really be guaranteed without the United States being involved. And what would you say to a skeptical Ukraine who may hear that and say, we need the U.S. involved?
Ukrainians do need the U.S. involved, and that's why it's important that the discussions where the United States will continue to provide military assistance, and the Secretary said that. And we've got the Secretary of the Treasury there in Ukraine right now discussing this rare earths deal that will be the way that the United States can continue to support the Ukrainians. But you're right, the United States needs to be involved, and there are ways that the United States can support a European peacekeeping force. Again, European deterrent force, not peacekeeping, a European deterrent force. There are ways the United States can help without putting troops on the ground.
Let me read you a little bit of what President Zelenskyy is quoted as having said in a recent interview. Get your reaction on the other side. He says, we will swap one territory for another. I don't know. We will see. But all our territories are important. There is no priority. What do you hear in those words, Ambassador?
Well, he's clearly referring to the fact that the Ukrainians occupy and control a part of Russia. They invaded across the border into Russia last summer, and they still occupy somewhere around 400 square miles of Russian territory. And so President Zelenskyy has said, look, we will pull out our troops from Russian territory, and you, Russians, pull your troops out of Ukrainian territory. There's a big difference in terms of landmass that we're talking about on that, but that, I'm sure, is what President Zelenskyy is talking about.
Let me finally, Ambassador, just ask you about this prisoner swap, the significance of having Mark Fogel, another American, now home. What do you make of it? You heard President Trump there say you could be a big part of a broader deal with Russia and Ukraine. What do you think the potential implications are?
If President Trump can use the leverage that he clearly has, economically, diplomatically, militarily, to bring President Putin to the table, this conversation about prisoner exchanges, this conversation about relationships between the United States and Russia can be part of that. President Trump does have leverage over President Putin, and President Putin understands that. President Putin's economy is fragile. President Trump referred to that. President Putin is ruining his country. President Trump referred to that. So this is an indication that President Trump does have the capability to bring Putin to the table and make a deal with the Ukrainians.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, you always give us such critical information and insight. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.